Hello, my name is Ryan Post, and I am here to present my Capstone project for the Master of Science in Strategic Leadership program at UC. The subject of this presentation is the impact of human capital strategies on the agency level leaders of the 1102 contracting career field. Whenever I talk about my job and what I do for a living, it is common for people to misunderstand me. I could sit here and talk to you all day about the different elements of the federal government and the Department of Defense, also known as the DoD. So, how do you break down the DoD? Most people would start breaking down the DoD by dividing it into the services that I have listed on the left hand side of this slide. But it is important to realize that the DoD is divided in more than just this one way. The Secretary of Defense splits it up differently into subdivisions, and on the right hand side of this slide you will see some examples of these subdivisions. The subdivisions on the right are designed to support the services on the left. The President appoints a secretary for each subdivision, who is typically addressed as the Undersecretary of Defense or the Assistant Secretary of Defense. And one of the primary duties of these appointed secretaries is imposing and implementing strategy. On this day in 2015, the Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics subdivision of the DoD, also known as the AT&L, is led by the Undersecretary of Defense for AT&L, Mr. Frank Kendall. The big picture is here on this slide. You have the DoD, the AT&L, and the 1102 contracting career field, which is made up of contracting professionals. Contracting professionals are the primary stakeholder for this study, and I am one of them. But like I said on the previous slide, it is common for people to misunderstand me when I tell them what I do for a living. 99% of the time when I tell people that I am a contracting officer for the DoD, they misunderstand me and assume that I am a contractor. But a contracting officer and a contractor are on opposite sides of the table. Think of it this way. The DoD cannot do everything on their own and frequently contracts with the private sector to provide their expertise for a variety of different things like supplies, services, construction, etc. Just to name a few examples, contracting officers hire contractors to build Navy ships, design weapon systems, and manufacture uniforms and equipment. I will assure you that the DoD does not have their military members sitting around in a circle trying to make anti-ballistic missiles, nor are they sitting around sewing fabrics together to make uniforms. They always hire contractors to do that work for them. With all that being said, keep in mind that these contractors are not performing this work out of the goodness of their hearts. There is a price tag associated with their work, and that is why the DoD needs contracting officers to ensure that those price tags are negotiated and that taxpayer dollars are spent in a fair and reasonable manner. The purpose of this research is to examine the human capital strategies being implemented at the top of the DoD AT&L and the impact of those strategies on the agency level leaders of the 1102 contracting career field. And for the remainder of this presentation, I am going to explain what I did, why I did it, and what I found. USA Jobs is my primary influence for conducting this study. USA Jobs is a website where job seekers go to search for careers with the federal government, and there's always an abundance of 1102 careers posted on there, which makes me wonder why. And is it really that bad of a job? There are literally hundreds of 1102 jobs posted in locations across the world at all times, no matter what time of year it is. This can be advantageous for a member of the career field like myself to know that I have options on where I want to work, but it has to be problematic for the career field as a whole to always have so many vacancies. So the big question that I'm always asking myself is why are there always so many vacancies posted out there? Here are the qualitative research methods that I use to collect data on my problem. According to Creswell, qualitative research is an approach for exploring and understanding the meaning individuals or groups ascribe to a social or human problem. Here is what the time frame looks like for the research that I conducted. My research spanned most of September, all of October, and concluded on November 1st. For the first half of the period, I conducted observations, and the second half is when I got into my document analysis and interviews. The first research method that I incorporated was qualitative observations. I conducted my observations by turning to a social media site for professionals that most of you have probably heard of called LinkedIn. For a few years now, I have been following a special interest group on LinkedIn that is dedicated to the 1102 contracting career field. And as of September 2015, this group had over 7,000 members and a very active discussion board, so this appeared to be a great place to conduct observations. I posted a discussion topic in the group asking, what are the current issues in the 1102 contracting career field? And as I mentioned on the previous slide, I observed that discussion for a 30-day period. By the end of that period, I had received 5 responses in total. Issues such as high turnover, insufficient staffing, inadequate training, and overly accelerated promotion tracks were the recurring themes that came back in those responses. These issues were in the same ballpark as what I was expecting, but conducting these observations helped to confirm my expectations. The second research method that I used was qualitative document analysis, and the data that I collected from my observations on LinkedIn is what guided me to the documents that I found using this method. In my research, I found some interesting news articles from 2009 through 2015 that are somewhat conflicting, and I'm going to elaborate on those here in a few minutes. I found journal articles that questioned some of the reform that was done to the 1102 contracting career field and its requirements for hiring people. I also found technical reports on some of the strategies that have been implemented to help resolve human capital issues. The third research method that I used was conducting qualitative interviews with leaders at the agency level. These interviews were unique because agency level leaders do not have a voice in the media, or anywhere else for that matter, because the DoD and every other sector of the government uses their public affairs office to control what information is released. With that being said, the names of my interviewees will remain anonymous. I was able to interview 4 individuals from the 2 control groups listed here. Both groups were from the DoD, of course, but they are very different from one another. One represented the Army and the other represented the Navy. One group was from the West Coast and one was from the East. I would like to have had a third group from an overseas agency, but I wasn't able to connect on that. However, 2 of my interviewees did have prior experiences in the career field working for agencies in Italy and Japan. Up to this point, I have described to you that my organization is the DoD AT&L and that my stakeholders are contracting professionals. I've also described the qualitative research methods that I've used. Now I'm going to describe what I've found and how it impacts agency level leaders. The Defense Acquisition Workforce Improvement Act, or DWIA, was the first strategy implemented by the DoD to reform the contracting career field. It has been around for over 20 years and has had a huge impact on the agency level. One of the biggest impacts of this law is that it raised the requirements for hiring a contracting officer. It established that contracting officers are required to have a bachelor's degree with 24 hours of business-related credits, as well as complete additional certifications at the Defense Acquisition University, which was stood up by this law. Although this strategy came into play over 20 years ago, it has taken a long time to implement. There are still acting contracting officers out there today that do not meet these requirements. It established uniformity across the whole DoD, but at the same time it limited the control of hiring new employees for the agency level. Agency level leaders cannot hire who they feel is best qualified. They have to hire based on requirements set by someone in DC instead. In order to overcome the DWIA requirements, things get more complex for agency level leaders. I read a research report about a strategy that agencies can use called the Expedited Hiring Authority. This is a strategy used to accelerate the hiring process in the federal government from what usually takes 4 months to just a week or two. There are different strategies for personnel systems too. Many agencies use the General Schedule, or GS, system that pays employees based on seniority. But I also read a report about a pay-for-performance system that is being implemented by some agencies to help retain employees. Pay for performance is attractive to some of the young and up-and-coming employees, but it is not as attractive for those that have been around for a while and have already earned their seniority. But if you are an agency level leader and you want to try using the EHA strategy or the pay for performance strategy, it's not going to happen for you overnight. You have to have the buy-in from your higher chain of command, and you have to have the resources and time required to train your people on how to implement these strategies. Another conclusion that I was able to draw from my document analysis and interviews with agency level leaders is that insufficient staffing is the central issue here. This ties back in with earlier in my presentation when I was talking about all the job vacancies being posted on USA Jobs. Issues like high turnover and overly accelerated promotion tracks are typically an outcome or result of insufficient staffing. My research included an article from 2009 when the then Secretary of Defense was Robert Gates, and he implemented a strategy to increase the AT&L by 15%, or 20,000 employees. Then, just recently in 2015, Robert Gates, who is now the former Secretary of Defense, testified in front of the Senate admitting that the strategy did not really work out that well. He said that it added an extra layer of bureaucracy that didn't really help to speed up the acquisition process at all within the DoD. So a lot of the leaders sitting at all different levels of the DoD AT&L are basically sitting back and shrugging their shoulders right now on the subject of staffing. The DoD's demand for contracting work to the private sector is not going to go away in the foreseeable future. Therefore, despite staffing problems that are widespread within the DoD AT&L at this time, agencies are still expected to meet their mission regardless. Even with the former Secretary of Defense recently admitting to the Senate that his staffing strategy was not as effective as he had hoped, that's all part of the game too. Sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, and there's no such thing as the perfect strategy. My recommendation to agency level leaders is to stay the course and do what you can from your level to prevent staffing issues. For example, take a couple pages out of Lawler's book about treating people right. Also, there is K&P's 5 Practices of Exemplary Leadership. These are some standard examples of leadership that you cannot be stripped of, no matter how much reform and centralization is done. These things have a powerful impact on your organizational issues, whether it be staffing, high turnover, promotions, etc. Here are my take-home points. Number 1 is that even though DWIA is over 20 years old, the agency is still having trouble adjusting. If you don't believe me, just look at all the job vacancies posted on USA Jobs. The contributing factor that is most significant is that DWIA raised the education requirements for becoming a contracting officer, and when you combine that with the fact that the DoD contracts out more of its work than ever before, it causes a struggle. You could also make the argument that this should have been worked out by now, but it hasn't. All of my interviewees liked the idea of going back to localizing the education requirements for hiring new employees, instead of doing what DWIA did by centralizing the requirements across the board. Point number 2 is that even though the former Secretary of Defense recently testified to the Senate that the AT&L's staffing strategy from 2009 was ineffective, that does not mean that anyone is ready to throw in the towel. Failure is part of strategy too, and it is back to the drawing board for the AT&L to figure out staffing. Agency level leaders are just going to have to hang tough and provide feedback when the opportunity arises. In terms of expanding on the research that I have conducted, there are a couple other areas that I would like to explore if time permitted. Quantitatively, I would be interested in finding out what percentage of the 1102 contracting career field was hired via the Expedited Hiring Authority. And I would be equally as interested in finding out what percentage of the career field is using the performance-based personnel system instead of the more common general schedule GS system that is based on seniority. This was information that I was unable to attain at the time of this study. Also, to put a little different twist on this topic, I would be interested in researching how much of an issue staffing is in areas where the cost of living is low. I question this because federal employees are receiving federally competitive salaries, and when you put these jobs in areas away from the Beltway in DC, for example, they are often jobs that are hard to get. This is the last slide with all of my references, and before I go, I would like to thank my audience for your attention to this presentation and open the table for any questions or comments. Thank you.